Hi, welcome to Wisdom and Beyond. I'm Dr. Teena Cahill, and today we have my good friend, Dr. Phyllis Marganoff. Hello there, Phyllis.
Hi, Teena.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
And you went to Rutgers, is that right? You got your doctorate at Rutgers
I
University, and you have a practice up in well, one in Princeton, up in the Millstone area. Is that where your other practice is?
Right.
And you specialize in sort of communication and relationships. Would that be true?
Yes. Yes.
And you did some training with John Gottman. Tell me who he is, Dr. John Gottman.
John Gottman is a psychologist who was for 30 years at the University of Washington doing research on what makes relationships successful and happy.
Man, we could all use that.
Yes, yes.
I love his book, The 7 Principles of a Successful Marriage.
Yes,
Whenever
7 principles for making marriage work.
Is that what it's called?
Yes, that's
well,
what it's
whenever my kids get married, I give them that. So,
Oh,
and
that's
now
great.
they're no longer offended. The first one was sort of offended. I said, no, no, no. I just think this should come with a check.
Absolutely. It's a great gift. In fact, John Gottman and his wife Julie also do workshops, weekend workshops out in Seattle, and I've often thought that when my daughter's ready to get married, I'm giving her a workshop.
A workshop.
gift
I don't think it's
before.
even better. That's great. Well, one of the things I think is so great is Gottman talks about in his book that one of the big things that makes a marriage work, or probably any close relationship, is that we treat one another like friends. I just think that's a big message. So you and I are going to talk about relationships today, but in a little bit different way. You know, I believe that we're all caregivers in some way. My radio show, which is on Web Talk Radio, is Nurturing the Nurturers, and it's a show for caregivers. And I like caregivers to see themselves as leaders and be empowered and all those kinds of things. But I think that really has to start in knowing how to speak from an empowered place with our loved one, and also helping them speak from an empowered place. I mean, it doesn't feel so good to be a care receiver, right? I don't think that's any position anybody wants, right?
Well, not if it's all about passively receiving.
Exactly, that's my point. And now they've changed the lingo, so now the language is care partners, which I really think is a great one. So we're going to talk a little bit now about how you would apply some of what Gottman has to say about good marriages or good relationships to caregiving. You know, there are over 50 million caregivers in this country. About 80% of them are women. The ones I think get left out are the men, because I've met some wonderful men who are wonderful caregivers, but we don't really have a model for men in caregiving. I think we have more of a model for women in that they're reared to be caregivers, which I consider not a great model. I want to change that model a little bit. But how do you think? I think caregiving is having relationships times 10.
I think you're absolutely right, because there's an intensity about that. It's like having all your eggs in one basket emotionally, because so much of one's sense of self-esteem grows out of how the person that you're partnering with around caregiving is feeling, doing.
That's right. Have I been successful?
Yeah.
And we're going to talk mostly here about spousal caregiving. There's a wonderful website, thealzheimerspouse.com, that my friend Joan Gershman runs, and you can't imagine the millions of hits that she gets, because all over this country there are men and women caring for someone who may have a memory disorder, but people are also caring for all kinds of different issues. And I think that for women, we're too good. I think that we have to be perfect all the time. We have to be good in all things. I like what Erica Jong said, show me a woman who doesn't feel guilty and I'll show you a man.
Well, I don't know if you're aware of Claudia Bepko and Joanne Creston's book, Too Good for Her Own Good.
Yes, I do.
That says it all.
It
It's
does.
an old book.
Yes.
But talk about those rules that women try to
know.
follow that contradict one another.
Yeah.
So if you try to follow one rule,
You must do it all. I must do it all, but I must be perfect.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm judged by everything that I touch.
Yeah.
Even people and things I can't control. It's all about me.
Yes.
I mean, and so that's really why I'm trying to change the model on caregiving. That's what my book was about, The Cahill Factor, which is about an empowered model of caregiving, an empowered life. And so Gottman's language is pretty empowered language. I mean, I think people sometimes get empowered and assertive and aggressive mixed up. But if we're not empowered, if we're not assertive in our communications, we're more likely to be aggressive, and that's hurtful.
well, I think that Gottman's research showed that people start out with the best of intentions
Absolutely.
relationally.
I think we all want to do our
And
best.
as the tension builds up, if
Yeah.
things go wrong, people get flooded,
Right.
emotionally flooded. What he calls flooding really refers to that rapid heartbeat,
Right.
the increased perspiration, respiration, etc., that really kind of shuts off the thinking part of the brain.
That's right.
And people start operating from this very primitive.
From that I like to say this is like our friend Karen Cohen talked about, this is the part of our brain that doesn't think. It's about survival. This is the part that thinks. And we now know that when the survival part is firing a lot, the thinking part doesn't fire quite as much. And if you're a neurologist, I'm really sorry to have made it so simple.
and Gottman's research showed that when that happens, the only thing that's helpful is to stop the music. Stop, say, we need to take a break, do some repair. And it takes 20 minutes,
Right.
minimum. So any kind of communication between any two people
Right.
is going to fail.
In our house, we call it setting the reset button. Brooke, my husband, was a pilot, so whenever things get a little tense, I will say to him, what do you say we set the reset button?
Yeah.
Or he'll say to me, reset, time to, and so we're taking a break.
Yeah, one of my clients this morning said, oh, a do-over.
A do-over,
And
absolutely.
I wasn't quite sure what he meant. He said, oh, in athletics, you
Right,
know, you
right.
do it, a do-over.
All right, so Gottman is saying that we really want to dumb down the conflict, right? We want to dumb down the conflict. When we find that we're just reacting from that place that's just about survival or winning or whatever, we want to take a break, which is very much like Steinberg at Tufts, who does that stuff on conflict resolution. And, you know, he talks about the different ways of handling conflict, but one of the best ways is do nothing. And that's really what you're talking about.
Well, in Gottman's case, it was clear from the couples that he studied that you can't simply do nothing. You can't simply walk away.
Right, in a
It's
hostile
very
way.
important.
Right.
Well, in any kind of way. His research showed that that would be regarded as stonewalling, and it's
Okay.
important to articulate
So how would he
verbally.
have people take a break?
He would have someone in that situation say, I'm getting flooded. I need to take
Okay.
a break. Let's come back to this in 20 minutes, or
Okay.
let's come back to
Right,
this
okay.
back to
Right.
this tomorrow.
Right, so
But that
flooded
you-
would mean I'm feeling overwhelmed with emotion. Let's take a break.
Yes.
Is that right?
Let's take a break. Let's take a walk. Let's listen to some music if you can stay in the presence of the other person. If not, I need to go take a walk by myself. But state specifically that you're leaving the scene and set a time to come back to it.
And so I think that's really good advice, especially in the early stages of caregiving, maybe when there's been a crisis and the caregiver, the new caregiver now, who suddenly takes on that role. It took me 10 years to realize I was a caregiver. I just thought I was a loving wife. So, you know, identifying yourself as a caregiver probably is the first step. But I think that in the beginning stages of that you do feel flooded with all kinds of decisions, all kinds of emotion, all kinds of fear and change, I mean, all this emotion. So that might be something for someone to do if they're newly in a crisis situation. Just take a break, calm it down, and come back, because they're having...
Well, one of the things that I tell couples that I work with is it's incumbent upon you to recognize the signs of flooding very early in the process.
So now how do you ask them to do
when
that?
When you feel that first little tingle, the tiniest tingle of irritation, when your stomach starts to do that thing, or your heart starts to just beat a little more rapidly, you have to take responsibility for saying, it's time to take a break. I tell people, when you first became sexually active, you didn't know what was going on in your body. It just kind of happened.
Right.
Likewise, if you're not paying attention, but as you've matured, you now know the signs of arousal,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know your body. Well, the same thing is true when it comes to anger and flooding.
Learn what the very
Learn what
beginning
your
parts of
own
it feel like.
signals are,
Okay.
so that you can take a break early enough in the process.
Okay. So Gottman would say then, when things get hot and heavy, say I'm feeling overwhelmed, take a 20-minute break with or without your partner, depending on what happens, how that works out, and then what would you do?
And then come back to it.
And
Come back
revisit
to it.
what you're
And
discussing.
one thing that his research showed, and this is particularly important, I think, since so many caregivers or care partners are women, that there are things that men do and that women do that either facilitate or interfere with communication. And one thing that women tend to do is use what he calls a harsh startup. They start with critical,
You statements,
yes,
as opposed to I statements.
and things like always and never.
Right.
Like you always and
Right.
you never.
Right.
Avoid those. Avoid criticism. Accentuate the positive so that if you want a positive behavior,
Yes.
start softly with, rather than you always
Right.
leave the bathroom a mess after you've been in there.
What I always say to people is that when we make you statements, you did this, you did that, you're going to have an emotional reaction, pretty much anger, anxiety, whatever. And we know that you're going to feel punished. And when you feel punished, punishment makes you feel anxious or whatever, and then that inhibits learning. So nobody's really going to be able to learn in a situation like that. That we want to make I statements, because if I say to you, I feel really sad when you do that because it makes me think you don't care about me or something like that, that's a much softer statement than, I can't believe you're not listening to me.
Exactly. And in Gottman's language, he would say, avoid criticism, and the antidote for that is complaining. And what you just described is a complaint.
Right.
I feel bad
That's
when you
right.
do X. It's
Right.
very specific.
Yes.
You own
You're taking
the
responsibility
experience,
for your own feelings.
and you point out specifically what the issue is, as opposed to you always.
Rather than a global issue.
Global,
You're
right.
just bad in all ways.
So
Yeah.
complaining is fine, because complaining is specific, and it involves owning responsibility
Right.
for your feelings.
And so I think all of that gets magnified in a caregiving relationship, because caregivers may be called upon to budget their time in such a way that they know they have to take care of the needs of somebody else before their own needs, or maybe not. I mean, but to have that dialogue of not making this generalization of, I can never do anything I want because you always want me to do something, but rather say, I feel pressured when you want me to do that for you right now because I was trying to get this task done. That would
And-
be an example of the kind of thing where that would come up.
And Gottman would also suggest, in terms of the soft startup, saying to your care partner, I really appreciate it when
Yes.
you give me time to do, when you recognize
Yes.
that I'm doing a task that needs
Right.
doing and you're willing to wait.
Yes.
It means a lot to me that you're willing to wait for me.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
the soft startup.
That's great.
And the partner
That's great.
can hear it.
Letting them know what we all want to do things right. And
Right.
I think that when you're a member of this care team and you're the care receiver, you can start to think maybe you can't do anything right because you're not like you used to be, you can't do everything. But I think if a caregiver says to the care partner, look, thank you so much for waiting for me. I think that's a great idea. I really think that builds self-esteem and helps people feel
Yeah.
as if they're succeeding, which we
Again-
want everybody to do in a relationship, is succeed.
The Gottman research has as one of its little mottos, small positive things often.
Yes, I think, and it's called shaping, reinforcing successive approximations to the goal. You have a cognitive behaviorist talking to a Gottman therapist.
relational
A relational therapist. But shaping is reinforcing successive approximations to the goal. So if I want you to walk across the table, when you make that first step, I'm going to say, way to go, great
Yeah,
walking across
yeah.
the table.
Acknowledge
so that you'll
the
do
positive.
the second one and the third one. So it's
Yeah.
all the same kind
Yeah.
of thing. We just package it in different kinds
Yeah.
of language, right? You make me, I'm
Well,
laughing though.
and let me just, again, in terms of Gottman's research,
And he is based on
observed
research. Yes, that's right.
couple after
Yes, that's
couple
right.
after
I agree
couple
with that.
doing the things that work.
Gottman's got something that isn't found all that much, and that is he's got research on what it's shown that works. For example, 5 positive comments for every negative one.
Yeah.
Isn't that one of them?
Yes.
I was speaking at the Chautauqua Institute last week, and the day before I spoke, a fellow spoke on relationships. I was thinking about you. And I thought what he did was very funny, because, there are these gender issues. Even though we know that men and women are way more alike than different, right? We tend to have some gender issues. And he had a visual aid, and he held up this really long piece of paper that had about 100 things on it that women want. And then he said, and here's the paper, and it listed everything you can imagine. Be nice to me, say thank you, all the wonderful, hugs, kisses, whatever. Pick up, do the dishes, whatever. And on the guys, it had 2 things on it. Bring food and show up naked.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the brains aren't that different, but the hormones
Yeah,
are
that's
very
right.
different.
Testosterone
as I
and dopamine
say,
really make a difference.
I say, you marinate a steak in oil and garlic, and it tastes one way. You marinate a steak
right.
in lemon and honey,
Right.
and it tastes completely
That's right.
different. And that's
That's
that estrogen
That's right.
testosterone
That's
difference.
right.
So.
I agree. All right, so again, talking about relationships and sort of trying to apply it a little bit to caregiving. One of the things that caregivers talk about is that things change quite often. Things don't stay the same. And I call it the new normal. You'll sort of get used to things being one way, and then something changes. It's not always the health of the care receiver. Sometimes it's your own work or yourself, or maybe your own medical problems, or whatever it could be. But whenever anything changes in these caregiving relationships, I always hear people tell me that those are sort of critical times. And so I try to get them to see it as the new normal, but there might be many new normals. Now, knowing what you know about Gottman, what would you say about that? What's something someone could do in a situation like that?
Well, the Gottman research showed that if couples constantly attend to their friendship,
Yes.
paying attention
Yes.
to what they love and appreciate about one another, they're making deposits in an emotional bank account.
I think that is so great.
And if they've got a positive balance in the emotional bank account, these critical times of transition that can be laden with conflict are manageable
Yeah.
because you can draw
Yeah.
on the bank
And
account.
it's a great concept.
And you can give each other the benefit of the doubt because you remember how lovable this other person
Right.
really is.
And don't you think that one of the things that I believe in transparency. I believe in transparency in all relationships. But I think one of the things couples can learn to do is if they've done something and they feel a little bit upset about it, or they know they weren't quite as kind as they wanted to be or something, rather than just sort of waiting for the other person to sort of give them a break and say, well, this person has a lot in their emotional bank account, say, oops, I hope I can draw on my account right now, or something like that.
And that's
so you
what,
make humor, you bring humor into it.
And that's what Gottman would call a
Yes.
repair statement.
Exactly.
You know, you do repair
Right.
in an ongoing fashion.
Right. So what Gottman is saying is that you don't enter into a relationship and that's just it, but rather it's a dynamic, rolling, constantly changing event.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Absolutely.
And attending to that. But again, I think in the caregiving situation, all of that is magnified times 10 because there are all these other issues that are sort of piled upon that, in terms of perhaps somebody's cognition or their mobility or perhaps their language ability or just the things that you guys can do together that have to change. And so I think that, too bad, I don't know if Gottman's still writing. Is he still writing? Maybe you now have to write the
Oh,
book
he's still doing
on how to
work, yes.
apply this to
Yeah.
the caregiving. But as I go all over the country and I speak to thousands and thousands of caregivers, there really isn't anything on relationships with caregiving, and that's why I wanted you to talk a little bit about
And
it
how
today.
relationships are strained by that role shift.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I like the word care partners. I think that's a much better term because I got to tell you that my husband takes care of me in many ways. And, you know, he may not have to help me cross the street, but he certainly helps me in many ways. So I think it's a little demeaning to have this caregiver, care receiver language. I don't really like that all that well. What's another big idea from Gottman?
Well, I think this particularly applies with care partnering. There are 4 things that are poison to any relationship. I mentioned one of them already, which is criticism. Gottman's research revealed these 4 things that he labeled the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And if there is a significant amount of those 4 things going on, this relationship is not going to last. It's being poisoned.
And I don't think it has to just be in relationships. I have to tell you that I was traveling recently with someone who I found to be quite negative. And I had compassion for this person because I don't think he wanted to be that negative. I don't think he realized he was. It was just his style, and I could see that he was driving people away when I don't really think that's what he wanted. So I pulled out Gottman's thing and I said, excuse me, I just need to tell you, when we're traveling and doing this project, I have this rule. We each say 5 positive statements for every negative one. And he loved it. He followed the rule.
Yeah.
And he did. And it just changed the whole dynamic. I think that's one of the best things Gottman's ever said.
Well, for these 4 horsemen, he suggests an antidote for each. The criticism, the antidote is complaining.
Complaining.
Be specific.
I feel when you because.
And be specific.
I feel sad when you don't listen to me because it makes me think you don't care about me or whatever.
Instead
it
of
is.
contempt, show appreciation.
Yes.
And as you show appreciation, those little deposits in the bank account build up, And when things get rough, when the going gets rough, there's something to draw
So
on.
as your loved one does something that you like, just as you go along in life, instead of just saying, oh, well, isn't it nice he does it, you say, gee, that's so nice you do it.
Yes.
You say it out
and
loud.
again, you be specific.
Right.
I like the way you played with Johnny when he was
Right.
crying this
Right.
morning. It comforted him.
Right.
I like the way you go off to work every day
Right.
uncomplaining, even though
Right.
sometimes I know you'd rather
Right.
stay home, etc.
Right.
So the next of these four horsemen, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, the antidote is obvious. Accept responsibility.
Exactly.
When you blew it, say,
Say,
I blew it.
We all blow it.
Yep.
We all
I'm
blow
really
it.
sorry. I blew it. I hope I can do better the next time around. And stonewalling, I gave an example earlier of when things get tense or intense, rather than turning around and walking out of the room or staring at the television because you don't want
You don't
to
want to
participate.
talk, you don't want to be part of it, because you feel so horrible that you think you've done this
Yeah.
awful thing, so you just don't want to participate.
Instead, the antidote is say, this isn't working for me. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling flooded. Let's take a break and come back to this in 20 minutes. Or let's take a break and come back to it tomorrow morning because I'd like for this to work out.
Some way you can accidentally even do, sort of work through that in an imperfect way. When my husband and I were first together, one of my little mantras was we have to talk these things out, and he wasn't always all that interested in talking these things out. So one night we had this big fight, and I was really majorly ticked off, and I said, that's it, I've had it, probably used a 4-letter word, I'm going to bed. And he said to me, you can't go to bed yet, we haven't worked this out. And I went, oh, wait. Right? So then, do you know what my big deal was? Do I get out of bed and be a big girl? Or do I stay here and punish him when he's just did that which I wanted him to do? Major moment in my life. So I dragged myself out of bed and said something to the effect of, I don't really want to be here, but I know that I should, so let's talk, right? Sometimes that's the best we can
And
do.
that's taking responsibility.
Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
that's
and so
not
I don't
being
want people to
defensive.
think that we always do these things perfectly. I knew Gottman's work before that happened, and you know, it doesn't always work that we can do it all right, but when we don't do it the way we think can make a relationship work best, we just sort of own that and go forward.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great.
Exactly.
That's great. So tell me about you. You have a daughter.
I have a daughter.
You have a big relationship there.
I do.
Yes.
And right at this moment, she has returned home because due to the economy, her life changed. And
So all of this applies to mother-daughter relationships
absolutely.
and daughter-mother-son
And I have a
and
significant
father-son.
other, and all of this applies there too.
Sure.
And it's kind of an everyday part of everybody's life as far as I can see. And what I love about the Gottman work is, and his research, none of this is rocket science.
That's right.
It involves doing the things that when a relationship begins, you did naturally.
Right.
Like
Right.
you paid attention to everything your love object ate for breakfast,
Right.
what color socks.
Well, do you read Helen
it's-
Fisher, the anthropologist from Rutgers? I love her, right? What, The Physiology of Love, is that one of them? The Anatomy of Love, The Physiology of Emotion, right?
Something
She
like
talks about lust sort of mimicking obsessive compulsive stuff, that you think about the other person all the time. It, like you just said, it matters to you what they ate for dinner. It matters to you what everything they've done. But yes, after about, what, a year and a half, that kind of lust thing calms down a little bit.
And yet, to maintain the relationship,
Right.
it's important that those things continue to be important to you.
Absolutely. And that
So
we build the relationship deeper with these
yes,
kinds of strategies.
you have to have the facts, first of all,
Right.
of what you wore to work today
Right.
and what it meant to you
Right.
in order to do the next level, which is appreciate your partner.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's what Gottman really does. He builds a structure underneath two people that they can sort of follow to build the underpinning of the relationship. I mean, you know, it's fun to go out and party and it's fun to have a great time, but it's the underpinnings of a relationship that decide whether this relationship is going to make it or not.
Well, in fact, the visual that represents all of the findings of this research is what is called the sound relationship house. And
Yes.
it actually shows each level of the relationship and how you build from one to the other to get to the roof, which is making life's dreams come true and building a legacy to pass on.
Well, and one of the things you said to me before when we talked about this, you were on my radio show and we talked about it, was, and I thought you had a great visual, you talked about using these tools and strategies that Gottman gives us to sort of be the building blocks of of the basement, of the foundation of the
That's
house.
exactly
and
right.
that if you have a great foundation, you're less likely in tough times to blow the roof off. That the
That
roof
too.
stays there
That's
because
right.
the house is put together in a solid way.
Yes.
That's right. And I'm sure that we've all blown a few roofs off in our life, right? But it's
Probably.
not so, yeah, probably.
Probably
I
too.
hope
Yeah,
so.
I
I mean, it's
think
how we
so.
live and learn, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's something that we want to do all the time.
Definitely.
And so
not.
so again, what you're saying to me is that Gottman is talking about little steps every day, making sure that you look at the positive, not the negative, which I agree in. Let's look at what's right, not what's wrong. Not replacing criticism with owning responsibility for your own feelings and sharing your feelings in an I statement. Not being defensive, not trying to avoid talking about something because you think you're so horrible, because nobody's that horrible and we all make mistakes, right? Not stonewalling it so that we refuse to talk. And then what was the other one that you talked about? It would be the second one you talked about. I've left one out here.
Contempt.
Contempt.
Appreciation,
Yeah, as opposed
as
to
the
contempt.
antidote to contempt.
Yeah, it really
yes.
feels so really awful if we think somebody's contemptuous of us. That's a horrible feeling.
And that's why the everyday small positive appreciative statements make such a difference, because then everybody shows contempt every now and then. But if you've got a really strong foundation of appreciation, you know, and somebody shows a flicker of contempt, you can kind of brush it off as they're having a bad day.
Right. And I think that's an important thing to have happen in the caregiving relationship for both members of this caregiving team, to make sure that they look for positive things to say about the other partner.
Yeah.
Would they let them know that they appreciate them? I think that's a big part, because the things that were there before, the underpinnings of the relationships that were there before in terms of activities and all, may not be there now. And so people really have to know that they're valued and cared about. Both partners of the team have to know that.
When someone is in a position of receiving care, regardless of the terminology, it begins as somebody having a need. Often the person who's receiving care has contempt for himself or herself because of the new limitations. So it's especially important to be sensitive to that.
Right, and what I really like is for caregivers to get into classes where they can learn about these things, whether they could go talk to one another and share what they've learned about how to take this new stage of their relationship and make it as good as these other stages were. Well, Dr. Phyllis Markinoff, thank you so much for being with us.
You are so welcome.
Thank you
Teena.
all for being with us. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time here at Wisdom and Beyond. Bye-bye.